Imagine if we had free will. Wow, what a thought. It's almost scary to contemplate what it would be like to actually be able to choose and make decisions. Wouldn't that be just so amazing if we actually possessed such an agency? Well, one can dream, can't they? One can dream. But seriously, I don't see why anyone should ponder what it would be like to have free will, when it seems we already have it, or at least the illusion of it consciously. The hypothesis of determinism is the more apt ponderance, since it isn't what seems to be the case. Moreover, since the belief in determinism isn't rooted existentially, then at best it represents an assumptive abstraction formulated into a narrative based on interactions with the face value of sensory data, which itself must be questioned and dissected for philosophical integrity. But sage, if determinism is true, then there is no blame. And that's very satisfactory and entitling, right? Is it now? I can't see how determinism is all that empowering for the mere pittance of evading blame. It may instead represent more of a dereliction, for this presumption facilitates comfort in taking zero responsibility, and most assuredly ensures disempowerment, for responsibility and power are assigned to determinism, the concept of some outside natural mechanism unto which everything is a slave. And this is where the issue crops up. One of the most seriously detrimental features about determinism is its fatalistic undertones that subliminally condition the mind into an oppressed disposition. And what makes this particularly disconcerting is because it isn't true. It would be one thing if determinism was a truth, then it would be consistent to believe that everything occurs automatically. If existence is automated, then you are really just a helpless witness, strapped in for the ride. And if you are aware of this configuration, then there is no rational point in getting emotional about anything, or to strive for improvement, or to try and create any new causes. As what's the point? Existence does this all by itself, without the need of any existential assistance by an individual unit. So if we understand determinism, then any impassioned calls that implore us to get emotional about causes or to modify behaviors are really just a projection of someone's personal hang-up, and they really don't understand determinism. You can't be a rational proponent of determinism and assert, due to the laws of cause and effect, that there's still some kind of way to make decisions or to take actions that create effects. The fact that we have to live through it isn't a valid argument, as we don't have any choice in the matter. There's no not showing up. Whether or not the soldiers show up on the field of battle isn't an event that could unfold in a number of different ways depending on a transaction of some sort. There's only one way it turns out, and that's the way it turns out. There's no option for a multitude of varying possible outcomes that are dependent on an element of volition at play here. So if you really do believe in determinism, the best thing you can do is shut your mouth, as it is literally just blowing empty, hot air. They are pointless and futile. You have no right to blame, no right to complain, no right to assign guilt, and no right to expect anything to change for any reason. Only those who concede agency might have the rational consistency to engage in these behaviors. For a determinist, common sense dictates that these endeavors have no purpose. And to call this attitude fatalism is also inconsistent with determinism, as fatalism and determinism go hand in hand. The charge of fatalism is only consistent from those who concede agency. But, as I said, determinism isn't true. Not entirely, at least. And this is why determinism is so detrimental, as it will inevitably foster a fatalistic proclivity. And this is counterproductive, disempowering, and a complete delinquency of responsibility. Yet, with all that said, there is nevertheless deterministic features within illusory experience. To dismiss either free will or determinism completely in favor of the other would be a bit heavy-handed. Neither of them really exist in the grand scheme. But in terms of describing the existential experience of an egoic identity, I am erring on the side of compatibilism. That is to say that there are facets of both free will and determinism at play experientially. Now, how are interactions with these facets realized? Well, part of understanding how they seem to function has to do with what the focus of attention is fixed on and where the attachment of identification is being invested. On the egoic level, there seems to be choice. But as far as the ego itself actually making any of those choices, this is indeed illusory, much as the ego itself. The conscious mind does in fact operate in a sort of deterministic mode of being that experiences an illusion of choice. But the fact that some of us are able to consider it deterministic in abstractions is due to the formation of an identification solely with the conscious mind. In other words, we think we are the ego. Therefore, the scientific inquiry of the ego made with the externalization conditioning can lead to an ego's abstraction that we live in a deterministic universe, even though there is no ego or universe existing anywhere. The function of the will happens at a deeper level, down in the depths of our true essence. The consciousness only experiences the results after the will has already been exercised and new causality has already been initiated. This is because consciousness is rooted in the deeper subconscious, which can draw inspiration from nothingness and is detached from the binds of cause and effect. This deeper identity is the origin from which the consciousness is sourced. Hence, the free nature of will is more like the true nature of pure potential. So it's not that an ego has free will, but that the source of existence, our true nature, is free will itself. In other words, you don't have free will, you are free will. But it doesn't seem like this to a determinist, because he thinks the identity is the ego, the illusory self that experiences the outcome of free will, but of whom doesn't have any free will itself. And speculations of the illusion of conscious free choice are backed up by some testable scientific evidence if you need reassurance. As early results of scientific brain experiments reveal, the subconscious mind appears to be making decisions before the conscious mind even becomes aware of them. Now, this may seem odd, as it sets up an imaginary division where none exists. The subconscious mind does something before we become aware of it. How did we and the subconscious mind become separated? Herein lies the crux of the misunderstanding. Neuroscientists first began to take note of this phenomena back in the 60s. A couple of German scientists discovered a phenomenon they called, and I may be pronouncing this wrong, Bereitschaftspotential. 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 BP for short, which translates to readiness potential. Their discovery that the brain goes into a special state immediately prior to conscious awareness set off an entirely new field of interest. The scientists would have their subjects move their fingers, and the results of the EEG scans revealed a slow negative potential shift in the activity of the motor cortex right before the voluntary movement. This led to the conclusion that the subconscious mind was initiating the act, not the conscious. Subsequent experiments in the 80s only seemed to reinforce these findings as the experiment was repeated, this time while watching a clock with a dot circling around it. The data showed that the readiness potential, BP, started about 0.35 seconds earlier than the participants' reported conscious awareness. This would seem to indicate that there is no free will when it comes to our initiation of movements, but still leaves some room for our conscious mind to have a cognitive override afterwards, allowing it the chance to prevent the movement. So, in other words, we don't spur our movements, but we can have a chance at stopping them. And more recently, experiments making use of the most cutting-edge technologically advanced methods, such as implant electrodes and functional magnetic resonance imaging, seem to reinforce the BP effect even further, now with even more shocking results. The current experiments showing the BP effect occurring a whole second before conscious awareness, or sometimes up to 10 seconds prior. The implications suggesting that the cognitive delay is inherent to a system that operates in advance of conscious awareness, meaning that essentially the mind begins to first work subconsciously in anticipation of a decision, and once the specific circumstances are realized, it enters the conscious mind and the movement is made. Very interesting findings, to be sure, but even more interesting than the findings is the unquestioned conscious distinction that the conscious mind is somehow divided from the deeper subconscious mind. That since the process is initiated subconsciously, this somehow equates to a lack of free will and serves as evidence of determinism. Yet this conclusion is an assumption based mainly in abstractions. Hence, determinism is only valid depending upon where an existential agent intellectually decides the point of effectuation is established. The error here is in deciding that the inceptions of the subconscious mind are something extrinsic to our core being, somehow happening prior to reality, when in fact the subconscious mind is an integral component of reality and would be most accurately described as the real core of our being. Just because it operates below the shallow surface of the conscious mind doesn't mean it is pre-existing, separated, or operating independently. These are all just thoughts and concepts stemming from a narrow mindset and have nothing to do with the reality itself. In reality, inspiration arises from pure static potential, and this source is the wellspring of awareness. This is the soil wherein the subconscious mind has its roots. What could be described as the foundation of all dependent origination. This is the point of effectuation. And it isn't dependent on anything for its ability to manifest spontaneous sparks that flash into existence. But I know this doesn't sit well with many of you, as you have strong attachments to abstractions that are set on believing otherwise, lest the burden of the truth become too heavy to bear, collapsing and deconstructing an old false description of reality that has become so comfortable and familiar for far too long. So for those determined determinists who are having a hard time letting go of their dependency on intellectual structure, I leave you with this. If reality is predetermined, then it is, for all intents and purposes, automatic, much like a system of machinery, which we often hear determinism compared to. It can be considered automatic because it requires no operational guidance or preventative maintenance, as each link in the chain of causality works all by itself, relative only to previous links, with no interference from the volition of a free will. So, if this machinery is not dependent on any outside influence to run its course, it can be considered automatic. Yet, if we examine the definition of automatic more deeply, we will find an additional meaning of that which is done or occurs spontaneously, without conscious thought or intention. Think of that. If determinism is wholly decided by previous factors, and no factor can ever be linked to an original point of effectuation, then the entire system of determinism must be occurring spontaneously. A concept that is always thought to be completely at odds with deterministic law, yet is very much congruent with the possibilities of a free will. Hence, while both free will and determinism are illusory and not the reality, as even considering free will or determinism as reality overlooks the reality, within the framework of the illusion of sensory perception, both of these illusory features are represented and are compatible. And not surprisingly, find their context within awareness, the source of dependent origination, the point of effectuation.